Hannah, come.
So yeah, my question, in the book, and you talked about it a little bit today too, like you mentioned like the harmful effects of like toxic masculinity on your life. And I was just wondering like what your experience and perspective has been as like you're like a man, so you're like kind of in the majority group, but you're also like a black man, so that puts you in the minority group. So I just wanted to know like how those like interact with like masculinity.
Yeah.
Like what's your experience with that?
No, that's a good question, because my wife and I, she's laughing because we talk a lot about like privilege and stuff. And I always go, by virtue of being a man, I have to honor the truth of that frailty, if you will, like that I have benefited from being a man in this world, right? One of the things, one of our earliest conversations before we were married, my wife, we're a blended family, and my wife has three daughters. I have three bonus daughters, right? And she talked about how the first order of business when you leave the house, safety. She said, I think of safety first. I don't think of safety. You know what I mean? I mean, loosely, I'm like, if you see an armed person, like don't walk toward him, but when you're effeminate, we used to laugh, right? We used to be like, man, why girls always going to the bathroom in pairs, man? Like it's a tag team event? Like what, I mean, it was so misogynistic, it's like, dummy. Women think about safety all the time, and that was like, that there was this, so one of the toxic masculinity components I think I got growing up was that really a false sense of invincibility, right? That you have to create fear in other people. That's the only way you'll be respected, is if you can intimidate, right? And so that was a masculine component. But being a black man in this country, for me, there's a deep historical context of subjugation and shame, because black men couldn't protect their families, in the slave era, and even to a large degree in the Jim Crow era. We don't have a time in this country where black men have ever been to, en masse, really be the leaders of their community the way they should have been able to be. It's a very unique reality, and it's not it really flies in the face. Like, I had to deal with the fact that a lot of the anger that I saw in some of my patriarchs, that was a lot of the what's the word I'm looking for here, posturing, a lot of the posturing, whether it was bravado or it was womanizing, all these things, that it was an expression of compensation because of the power that black men didn't feel they had in a structure where literally you were taught, not in my era, but in the South and in the slave era, Jim Crow era, to step off the curb if white people were walking past you and not look them in the eyes, and that part was almost this. It was like it mitigated a lot of the masculine power that I think people associate with just being a man. It's hard to describe sometimes because I'll never be a woman, but it was very confusing. It's like, well, you're powerful, or you're supposed to be powerful, but I would watch how a lot of black men didn't like dealing with white men, and I used to wonder, is this just is this resentment purely racial, or is it something else? And I think that a lot of, I don't ever want to speak for anyone except me, but I came to realize that I think that black masculinity and white masculinity are not the same, because there is this diminishment of the humanity of the black body and of the black soul, and because that is such a foundational component of the United States of America, you can't seem to outrun that tapestry. Like, now, we know as black people that our history didn't start with slavery. Most people, when they think of their black history, they only think of that as an origin. But it's, for us, or for me, I had to try to reconcile, Hannah, and maybe I'm still doing it, trying to understand the privilege of masculinity and how the abuses have occurred toward women as a result of that patriarchy, while at the same time understanding that my mere existence, has been a threat to white men. And that is historically substantiated. So even if somebody now would say, I don't think, I was like, the data's just not there. The first person to suffer is going to be the person who stands to protect his community, because you have to eliminate any threat of reprisal. You have to make sure that those men don't even see themselves as men. They see themselves, they were called boy, and they were castrated, and there were slave patrols who would, put heads on the end of stakes, and it was very synonymous with what Romans did to send a message to anybody who would be an enemy of the state of Rome, that basically you don't F with Rome. If you do, this is what happens to you. And so there is that history, and so it's a lot to say about your question, just because it's made it difficult to become a man. If and I didn't grow up with a father, so my father's alive, but it was very complicated, and I didn't have him when I needed him. So, and I had to begin to ask questions like why, that weren't just scapegoat questions that made him insidious just by himself. There were forces at work that led to this kind of this kind of absolution, where you don't feel like you can take responsibility for what you should be taking responsibility for, and all these things. But I think my work as a man is to again, kind of like with the research piece, look for where the gaps are. What is the redefinition? What is God's estimation of manhood? Vulnerability is a huge part of that. Listening is a huge part of that. Understanding where right-handed power is polluting my space is a part of that. Stuff like that. So
I have to go run and get my cord and